Hi, in this video I'm going to show you how you can use the client-side data source component that's part of the NetAdvantage4 jQuery package. When you download and install the jQuery package, you'll see a lot of UI controls, the grid, the editors, the rating, the video player. But there's also a non-UI component called the data source. It's actually responsible for all the data manipulation and data handling operations done by the data bound control. So for example, in case of a grid, where you have things like paging, sorting, and other things being happening on the grid control, it's actually a data source control behind the scenes doing the work as far as the data is concerned. So in this example, we'll see how we can actually grab the data, connect to our data source control first, and then bind it to the grid. So let's get started. What I have in front of me is Visual Studio 2010 with a ASP.NET MVC project. But in this case, we're not going to use MVC. We're just going to work with plain HTML and JavaScript. So I'm going to come down here, right click, and say add a new HTML file. And I'm going to call this HTML page IG data source OData. Now in this particular example, we'll use a Netflix feed which exposes all of its catalog and title information over to the public, and we'll use the data source control to actually grab that information using the OData protocol and then bind that data to our grid control. So in here, first thing what I need is to set my script references, which will be needed for the controls to instantiate and work on the client side. So I'm going to grab a bunch of scripts here. I'm going to grab the jQuery core, then the jQuery UI, so that our grid can work. Then we'll need the jQuery templating plugin, because the grid uses templating, and we'll lay out the records the way we want it. So we'll use the templating plugin as well, and also the actual Infogistix JavaScript. So here's where the definition of all the controls are, and we're going to include that in as well. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to grab some CSS. So we'll grab the igui.min.css first, and also the jQuery custom CSS. Now all of these JavaScript and CSS are part of the install. So when you download a product, you can go to the install location and grab these folders and put them in your project and just drag and drop into your application like I did. So once we have the references, we'll create a placeholder for our grid control. So I'm going to say table, give it an ID of IG grid, and we'll just leave it like that. And what we're going to do now is we'll just write script to grab data from OData feed and bind it to the grid element here. So we're going to create a script block first, and then in the jQuery onload function, which gets fired as soon as the DOM is initialized, we are going to first create our data source component. Even before we do that, we need to kind of have a URL for that feed. So we're going to create a variable URL, and it's a string, and it's going to be the actual URL for that feed that we want to use to grab our data. So we're going to call OData netflix.com/catalog/titles, and then set up some query string parameters. So we're going to say format needs to be JSON, but actually we need JSONP, so we're going to also add another parameter callback, which will turn that JSON call into a JSONP data. And we just leave it as a question mark because we don't need to make a callback method. This will just return our data, and the data source component will be able to handle everything from here on out. Once we have our URL set, let's new up a client-side data source control. So it's like client ds equals new, and we're going to call this IG JSONP data source. So you'll see as I'm typing in, I'm getting IntelliSense in Visual Studio, and I'm going to go directly to our JSONP data source. But even in IntelliSense, you can see there are a bunch of different data source controls. So on the base level, there is a base data source component, but then we have extensions of the data source depending on where you're pulling the data from. So if you're pulling data from JSONP like we are doing here, we're going to initialize a JSONP data source. If it's a plain JSON data source, you can initialize that one. If it's a table, that's what you're using as a data source, you can do that. There's a hierarchical data source. There's also a mashup data source. So there are a bunch of different options that you can use depending on the type of data that you need, or the type of data that your source that you're pulling your data from. So in this case, it's going to be JSON-P. So you're going to use that, and I will set a couple of options here. So first option we need is the actual data source property, which is going to be our URL. So because the JSON-P data source, it knows that it needs a URL, and it's going to make a call to that URL and grab the data for us. And next thing we need is the response data key. So once the data comes back in, what's the key that's looking for in order to grab the actual result set? So which we know it's going to be d.results. So we are setting it up here, and now our data source is basically good to go. When the form initializes, it's going to make the call to this URL and grab the data and store it into our client DS variable. The next thing we want to do is we want to display this data in some form. So we're going to use the grid to display our data. And I'm going to grab the grid element that you defined below and convert that into an IG grid. Once we do that, it's going to take this element and basically make it a jQuery client-side grid control. And in here, we're going to set up some options. Now, to save some time, I have written some client code here for the grid. So we're going to just take that and put it in here and kind of quickly go through it. So what we're doing here is that in our grid, we're saying virtualization to false. We're also setting auto-generated columns to false because we're defining the column here. We are using jQuery templating because there's going to be a lot of columns that will be returned from the Netflix feed. We don't want to display all the columns. So we will use jQuery templating to kind of lay out the column we want and only choose the columns that we want to display. And then by hand, we're setting up 3 different columns. We are setting the header text, the key, and the width of those columns. And then we are actually doing the same thing. Send the response data key, which is a d.results, and setting up our data source, which is the client DS that we just defined up here, and setting the height of the grid. So again, you saw just by doing that, grabbing the URL, putting it in our client DS, initializing our grid, and kind of binding it to the actual data source. Let's see what we have at runtime. And just by doing that, the client data source control made the call to the Netflix feed, and what it did was it basically brought in all the data from that feed and displayed it in our grid control, and bind pretty much all the information that that the Netflix was exposing, and here you have your grid control displaying that data. You can also enable features on top of it. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to go back to my Visual Studio, and I'm going to write some more script, and I'm going to add a feature to it called paging, because we want to page our data. So you'll see that I'm going to just work on the grid now, and I'm not even going to touch the data source. So we're going to say name paging, and let's set up a page size of 20. And let's run it again. So just by setting up a page size of 20, you saw that now it's just displaying 20 records at a time. It's giving me the overall record count. It's giving me the page numbers. I can jump to a different page if I wanted to, and I can use the next and previous buttons and so on and so forth. Even though we enable the feature on the grid itself, it's actually the data source that's handling the paging behind the scenes. The grid is just passing on the information, the page number, the number of records that it needs to display, and the data source control handles the making the call to the feed and then grabbing the right amount of records and display in the grid. And you also have the ability to set the number of pages or number of records that you want to display per page. So I can select 50 records per page, and it's going to display 50 rows at a time. So again, in this quick demo, you saw that it's fairly easy to use the client-side data source component to connect to your OData feed. Then once it's connected to your data source, you can bind it to a grid control and enable all these other operations like paging and sorting, and the data source behind the scenes handles it for you. Thanks for watching this video.
Infragistics. On the web at infragistics.com.